Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure for me to welcome you here. My name is Markus Mader. I'm the director of the Swiss Red Cross. It's great to have you here, and it's a great pleasure for us to be having this event with all the participants of the panel discussions and all the persons present here. This does make a difference, and I am sure this will be a mainstay in the topic. The Swiss Red Cross and the Directorate of International Law of the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs have the pleasure to welcome you here at the occasion of this online panel discussion on Switzerland's commitment for international humanitarian law. More than 150 years ago, on August 22nd, 1864, Henri Dunant's idea to protect those injured in war led to the adoption of the first Geneva Convention. And today's pillars of international humanitarian law were built on that first convention, namely the first four conventions of 1949 and the additional protocols for which Switzerland acts as its depository state. The idea of international humanitarian law is simple and convincing. There's rules also in war. Those rules are to protect persons and objects, and they limit the means and methods of warfare. Therefore, the respect for international humanitarian law is key to saving human lives, to protect the weakest, and to reduce suffering in war. And still, in the context of armed conflicts on the whole world, there are still violations of humanitarian law with all their terrible humanitarian consequences. In Syria, for example, members of the Swiss Red Cross have become witness to such consequences on a daily basis almost. And ever since the outbreak of hostilities back in 2011, many medical facilities have been destroyed. Millions of people are fleeing. Access to basic resources and the provision of medical care has been much limited in many areas. According to the joint Article 1 of the Geneva Conventions, the states are obliged to abide by international humanitarian law and to enforce its implementation. Now, what does Switzerland do in this area? Well, on August 12th this year, the Federal Council approved the first voluntary report for the implementation of international humanitarian law by Switzerland. The Swiss Red Cross co-authored that report, and obviously it welcomes the publication of this voluntary report. The report is an excellent starting point to talk about good practices, but also to mention challenges in connection with the abidance of humanitarian law by Switzerland. In order to open the topic, the head of the Directorate of International Law, Ambassador Corinne Ciceron-Bühler, will first introduce that voluntary report, and following that first presentation, we will have a panel discussion that will be moderated by journalist Karin Frey. We will have panelists from various walks of life that have to do with the implementation of humanitarian law in the field, in the army, and in parliament. In order to have a rich and constructive debate, you are all invited, as you are participating online in this event, to participate actively in this panel discussion. Do you have any questions on Switzerland's commitment in the area of humanitarian law? If you do, write your question in the chat of the video platform on the right-hand side of your screen. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I hand over to Ambassador Corinne Ciceron. Thank you very much for your attention, and have a rich and thoughtful evening. Thank you very much, Mr. Mader, for those kind words of introduction. It is indeed a great pleasure for me to be here to talk about a current and important topic, namely the need to respect international humanitarian law. I'm happy to tell you more about Switzerland's commitment in humanitarian law at this occasion. First of all, I'd like to stress the importance of international humanitarian law. International humanitarian law aims to preserve a shred of human qualities also in the context of armed conflicts. It protects people that do not or no longer participate in the hostilities, for example, civilians, medical or humanitarian staff. International humanitarian law also puts a stop to certain methods in warfare that lead to superfluous injuries or that are indiscriminate in its nature. For example, biological or chemical weapons that are banned. Humanitarian law over the years and through many conflicts has proven its effectiveness. It prevents or limits the consequences of armed conflicts on a daily basis and thus makes it easier to go back to peace at a later stage. And still, humanitarian law sometimes is broken, which leads to enormous humanitarian consequences, as we can see in Yemen, for example, or in Syria. And that's why we need to undertake all our efforts to make sure that there is better compliance with international humanitarian law. What does Switzerland do given all those challenges? Well, Federal Councillor Ignacio Casas likes to emphasize that internal and international policy are very closely related. Foreign policies of a country reflect the values of that country, and the international humanitarian law is part of Switzerland's DNA. The Geneva Conventions that are the foundation of humanitarian law were agreed in Geneva at the initiative of Switzerland. Therefore, Switzerland is very well positioned to play a key role through its neutrality, its humanitarian tradition, and by its status as a depository state of the Geneva Convention. Switzerland is designated as the country of international humanitarian law with Geneva as its capital. That explains why the respect and the propagation and the strengthening of international humanitarian law have long been top priorities of Swiss foreign policy. The Foreign Policy Strategy 2020 to 2023 has confirmed that focus. The propagation of international humanitarian law thus is one of 3 pillars of Swiss policy as regards Syria. In that respect, Switzerland has always demanded fast and unimpeded access for humanitarian aid, and it has also condemned the use of chemical weapons. Switzerland indeed stands for the respect of humanitarian law in ongoing armed conflicts, and it has certain means to do so. It can, for example, undertake diplomatic steps and call upon governments to respect international humanitarian law. Such démarches can remain confidential. Switzerland, secondly, can act in multilateral forums to call for the abidance by international humanitarian law, as it recently did in the connection with the conflict in Karabakh. And third, it can denounce any violations of international humanitarian law, as it did in the context of the armed conflict in Ukraine. And it can also denounce attacks on civilians, as it has repeatedly done in connection with attacks on civilians and medical facilities in Syria. Switzerland also acts against impunity. Together with 56 other states, it has called upon the Security Council of the United Nations to refer serious war crimes in Syria to the International Criminal Court. Switzerland also supports the international, bipartisan and independent mechanism for Syria. SRC-FDFA. This mechanism collects, safeguards, and analyzes evidence for violations of international humanitarian law, thus facilitating proceedings before national or international courts of law. There are many other examples for Switzerland's commitment. You will find them in the voluntary report for the implementation of humanitarian law that was agreed by the Federal Council on August 12th. Now, what is that report? On roughly 30 pages, the voluntary report details the implementation of international humanitarian law by Switzerland. It analyzes good practices and it analyzes central challenges in 6 areas. For example, the particular protection of the Red Cross emblem and of cultural property, regulation and means and methods of warfare, the dissemination of international humanitarian law and training. For each of the 6 chapters, the report details, first of all, the legal framework that the international humanitarian law provides. It talks about the Swiss framework, the Swiss legal framework for the implementation of international humanitarian law, which is in the competence of Parliament, and that's why we're happy to have 2 members of Parliament present tonight. The report third explains how Switzerland explains that legal framework in practical terms. That is, it talks about our good practices, but it also mentions the challenges we face. And I would like to mention 2 of them. Switzerland offers a safe haven for cultural goods, as an example of Swiss good practice. Cultural goods that are threatened by armed conflict disasters, and currently there are 320 such protected spaces in Switzerland. Now, there are challenges involved. For example, the challenge to collect evidence for war crimes committed abroad and thus violations of international humanitarian law. In order to meet those challenges, Switzerland very much calls upon international cooperation among justice authorities of international countries. It thus supports the Mutual Legal Assistance Initiative. It is an international initiative that proposes the agreement of a new contract in order to facilitate investigations and prosecution of some of the most serious war crimes. The publication of the voluntary report is a very important national milestone. It is the first time for our government to have agreed such a report as a tool of democratic dialogue. The report is available in German, French, Italian, and English, and it is available online and thus accessible to everyone. The publication of the voluntary report is also a milestone at the international level, because Switzerland is among the very first countries that have agreed such a report. Let me also talk about the drafting of that voluntary report. The voluntary report is the result of an in-depth reflection that was conducted by our interdepartmental committee for IHL in cooperation with the Swiss Red Cross and the ICRC. Our interdepartmental committee is comprised of representatives of the Department of Foreign Affairs, Defense, which is represented on the panel, Justice, the Economy and Internal Affairs, as well as the Federal Prosecutor. Such cooperation has made it possible to benefit of the expertise of all entities involved. And thus, we have also gained a common understanding of the measures our country takes to benefit international humanitarian law. Now, what are the steps ahead, having written that report? Well, first of all, we want to improve. The voluntary report will be accompanied by an action plan that the federal government will want to implement in the years ahead. This action plan foresees that Switzerland will bank on new technology, will make a contribution to clarify the application of international humanitarian law to new technologies like autonomous lethal weapon systems. Secondly, we encourage other countries to also draft their own voluntary report. Federal Counsel Ignacio Cassis stands for that, as well as our representatives in the federal department within our borders and without. Those efforts are important because voluntary reports will help foster the dialogue among states, and they also contribute to foster humanitarian law and to protect victims in armed conflict. Ladies and gentlemen, at international level, the publication of this report is a very strong signal that Switzerland remains committed to the international humanitarian law. We hope that the voluntary report will enable a democratic dialogue among national players in Switzerland. Through that dialogue, we hope to find means and ways to make sure that we can strengthen our commitment very much in line with our tradition and our humanitarian ambitions. With that, I thank you, and I hand over back to Karin Frey, the moderator of this evening. Thank you very much, Corinne Ciceron-Bühler, head of the Directorate of International Law of the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs. With that, we would like to open up the dialogue, a dialogue that you can participate in, ladies and gentlemen. Markus Mader mentioned it before. Make use of the chat function to write your question. And I will make sure that we can answer as many of your questions as possible, particularly in the second half of our panel that will last about an hour. Let's open up the dialogue, Switzerland and humanitarian law, what has already been done, what could be done more and better. I'm looking forward to our panelists. Our panelists are Karl Marchais, lawyer and head of the humanitarian law of the Swiss Army. He sees it as part of the mission the Swiss Army has. And he says it's a question of education, it's a question of training, of discipline and self-respect. I also welcome Elisabeth Schneider-Schneider. She is a member of Parliament of the National Council and member of the Foreign Policy Committee of the National Council. And she says Switzerland benefits from international humanitarian law. Welcome, Priska Seiler-Graf, also a member of Parliament of the Social Democratic Party. She's a member of the Security Policy Commission. And she sees Switzerland's position as difficult because Switzerland boasts itself as a depository state of the Geneva Conventions, and yet Switzerland earns money by selling arms. I also welcome Dominic Stillhart. He is head of the field force of the ICRC. He himself was in the field in many war zones, and he says it is of utmost importance for international humanitarian law to be lived, particularly with regard to the future, because that's where it helps most. We'll hear from him why. Well, ladies and gentlemen, Antonio Guterres, General Secretary of the United Nations, back in 2020 said, I recently talked about the winds of hope, but today I see the winds of craziness sweeping over the world. Yemen, Syria, one conflict after the other, conflicts feeding on each other, the situation spinning ever more out of control. Now, thinking about IHL and all those conflicts, what causes most worries and concerns for you? Ms. Schneider. But I'm very much concerned that multilateral efforts seem to lose in importance. Countries act on their own. It's more difficult to find a global understanding, which makes the world unstable. It does not help people all over the world, and I'm very much worried by this, not only within the United Nations, but also in other international organizations. I see a development unfolding that puts a stress on stability. Ms. Graf? Well, I worry very much that we still need to talk about the implementation of IHL. I worry that most serious war crimes are still being committed. I worry about the powerlessness that we all have facing this. On the other hand, I sometimes think about the role of Switzerland, which certainly does a lot of good things, but I'm sure we could do more. We'll certainly talk about that later. Dominic Stillhart, what about you? What raises your concerns? You saw the front. Well, look, it would be very difficult for me to do my work if I felt the misery with all my heart all the time. All the misery that I've been seeing for 30 years, but still, of course, I worry, I'm angry to see how civilians are being aggressed. And I recently saw that in Burkina Faso, where people in villages were being attacked by jihadist forces and are forced to flee. And once they reach cities, they get stigmatized as being proponents of jihadist groups. Mr. Mahder mentioned Syria. Over 10 years now, the civilian population has been suffering from the power policies that are being enforced there, and that really makes me sad. And that's why the discussion we're having today is so important, and the implementation of IHL is of utmost importance. Karl Marshall. Well, I've taken a picture with me. It was repeatedly mentioned. Look at this city of Homs. Look at the devastation. Think of all the direct and indirect consequences for civilians, young people and old. And we see the balance between military missions and humanity is not given. Now, there's no electricity, there's no water, there's no light. And there's nothing to provide heat. There's no medical care. The schools were destroyed. There's no education. Entire generations were sacrificed. And that's the benchmark for me as person in charge of in the implementation of international humanitarian law in the Swiss Army, namely to make sure such images no longer are taken, they no longer can happen. I need to make sure that the Swiss Army will never act in such a manner. We all hope it never will have to, but of course, IHL needs to be implemented preventively. It needs to be trained. You say we're lucky not to be involved in a conflict directly. You're head of the Department of International Humanitarian Law. What does Swiss Army do there? Well, I think I said it. Abiding by that law is our primary objective. We need to get the balance right. We need to preserve it, and IHL binds us and binds all armies, and also in times of peace. But very specifically, what do you do? Well, very specifically, we need to make sure that in our everyday activities, IHL is integrated, disseminated, taught, trained, integrated in processes at staff and line levels. It needs to be adopted in plans. Its principles need to be disseminated and propagated. It needs to be made very clear what is a legitimate military goal and what is a protected goal, or target rather, so that we can strike the necessary balance and not act in a disproportionate manner. Such principles need to be trained, and that starts today. It takes time. Well, the question we ask is, what does Switzerland do already, and what could it do better? Ms. Schneider, in the voluntary report, it says, Switzerland is characterized by its neutrality, its humanitarian tradition, and its status as depository state of the Geneva Conventions. And for that reason, abidance, dissemination, and strengthening of IHL is among its primary foci. You are a member of the Foreign Policy Committee. How often do you talk about IHL? Well, not directly so, and I'm not sure whether all members of the Foreign Policy Committee did read that voluntary report. Indirectly so, however, international humanitarian law is very much part and parcel of the discussion. As I was preparing for this event, I myself felt that humanitarian law is a given for us. After all, Switzerland is the mother of IHL, with Geneva its capital, with the emblem of the Red Cross, which is also represented in our flag, and with this we carry all of this into the international world, and we indeed have great responsibility to make sure that IHL is internationally enforced. Switzerland's performance was very good in past years, and today IHL has become a matter of course with all our humanitarian tradition. And now we need to make sure that we do not forget it. We need to carry the torch. And I think that report is a good foundation for doing so. Ms. Seiler-Graf, I think I mentioned it before. You are not exclusively positive when it comes to Switzerland's solution. For example, hand grenades were found among a jihadist activist, and RUAC produces such hand grenades, and hand grenades produced by RUAC were used in the Syrian war. Well, yes, that is a reproach that I levy against Switzerland. At times, we're a bit hypocritical. There is this clear line of separation between humanitarian efforts, where we're very strong and credible. On the other hand, though, we hear the call of money. There are economic interests. We have a military industry, or an industry of war. And then the enforcement of such rules seem to lose in importance. We have an excellent law on the export of war materials is good, the way it was drafted, but it has many loopholes. It's not implemented well. And there was a corrective initiative to it, when indeed the Federal Council took into consideration for war materials to be exported to countries that were in a state of war. That crosses a red line. Here we need to be very careful. We have a lot to lose. Indeed, we have great credibility in the world as the mother of humanitarian law. And I think we should not lose that. That's the role Switzerland has, and this is a role that Switzerland has indeed. Dominic Stillhardt, hearing this and reading such headlines as someone from the field, this must hurt. It does, because we see that many states put economic interests first sometimes, and we keep repeating that it's very important for international humanitarian law not to be talked about in international forums only, but for it to be implemented where countries have a possibility to have an effect. Export of war material is such a possibility to enforce international humanitarian law on the basis of the relationships necessary for the export of materials. Have things become more difficult? Because today, conflicts that we witness are no longer conflicts between nations only. Sometimes it's individual groups fighting against each other. Can you work with such groups? Well, of course you can. In our operations, we are in contact with about 500 armed groups of conflict, and of course things have become more complicated in the battlefields. At the same time, however, many of our relationships that we have are at the level of states, and many are at the level of armed groups, and they're very well defined. We know who they're supported by. And sometimes there are relationships that are a bit blurred, but very many relationships where arms are being delivered, where there's relationships, are very clearly defined. And there we have our role. We call upon states to make sure that the implementation of international humanitarian law is respected also by the groups those states support. Where is IHL most often violated? Well, we talked about Syria, we talked about Yemen, we talked about Libya. Hence, in all major areas of conflicts, we see serious infringements of IHL. My question was less geographical. I rather thought of the areas of humanitarian law. Well, one large problem that we saw in recent years were attacks on medical facilities. Because we saw public institutions, public facilities, public medical facilities were openly attacked to make sure that civilians no longer had access to them, thus forcing people to flee. That is clearly one of the most serious problems we see, particularly in conflicts like Syria or Yemen. Question for everyone. In such a situation, such a war, we saw the picture of Homs. What can Switzerland do? Well, Switzerland has credibility. And indeed, we need to strike the line between neutrality and the services of good offices we can offer, not to reproach one side only, not to take sides. That clearly is a mission the Red Cross can take over. This affords it with credibility. And I very much hope for the credibility of this institution to remain intact for long. Institutions like the Red Cross are of greatest importance to support peace, important for conflict resolution. Now, Switzerland, as a small country with a long-standing humanitarian tradition, can support such institutions. It can empower them. It can provide them all the necessary framework conditions for them to do their work in the context of international organizations. We need to act on the basis of our neutrality, also in our diplomatic efforts. This is not always easy politically, particularly in unfolding conflicts, Nagorno-Karabakh, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Turkey, Russia. Not to take sides here is very difficult, but our neutrality does offer us the possibility to act credibly and to try and broker peace, together with the organizations represented in International Geneva. It does offer a possibility for us to help. So it's small things, really. But if we look at what we could achieve, for example, in connection with the annexion of Crimea by Russia, we were then in the office of the presidency of the OECD, and we could achieve a lot. Of course, those efforts were short-term, but we could do a lot as a small country. Well, I also think that Switzerland can and should take the role of a mediator, which it does. This is something we're good at. This is where we're credible. But as I said, we need to work hard at remaining credible. We mentioned the conflict in Yemen. If we keep exporting war materials to Saudi Arabia, that leads the alliance of war against Yemen, this may not be quite as stringent, as credible. But indeed, Switzerland does have the role as a mediator, and it can play that role. Now we're talking about conflicts that are ongoing, but I think we have to take a step back, because it's very important to do everything in our power to make sure conflicts do not break out, do not arise. Their international cooperation is very important. And we have a role, for example, in not cutting the financial means of such organizations that can try and broker peace. We need to provide these institutions with funds. We need to allow them to train people and to send people to areas of conflict. Well, and I think also the soldier in the army can do a lot. We both met in the south last year. Please explain. Well, last year I was in Kosovo as head of the IHL, where I met a delegation of Swiss parliamentarians that travel to Kosovo, as is customary sometimes, and we were able to show them what we were doing there and what challenges we had. Well, yes, Swiss soldiers have the operational disadvantage in that they do not have the actual experience of wars, which is also advantageous because we're not burdened by the past. We can be free in how we present ourselves, and we can do what's necessary. We can be strong as we teach. We speak different languages. We can build bridges culturally. These are strong trump cards. Specifically doing what? Well, the example of Mali might be mentioned. The United Nations have a big problem to find French-speaking members for its international peacekeeping efforts. We send French-speaking soldiers in intelligence and in dialogue. My deputy, who is a French mother tongue, has a function now in Mali. Apart from training, we also have the possibility to build up something very important, namely trust. If I think of my experience as I was working for the ICRC as a lawyer, I was looking after French-speaking countries, and there, it's not about the dissemination of know-how only. No, it's about establishing trust to try and make sure that higher officers, generals, etc., start speaking together and finally come to the same conclusions. This only happens on the basis of trust, and that's what we can do. You're saying it's not about training soldiers in Switzerland only. You're also training people abroad. Is that correct? Yes, it is indeed. We sweep in front of our own doors, but we also try to have an active role outside of Switzerland through the ICRC or through the United Nations in New York, where we meet specialists at all levels. We send officers to Ghana, to the Peace Support Training Center, and these are people from private enterprises. Often they're being trained, they become specialists and start training others. We're also active at other centers. And that is a service we can provide. And 2 days ago, the Federal Council approved Mozambique for us as an active training center ground. And we will also contribute people to that mission too, to the DDR, which is the disarmament efforts, the return of young people that have known nothing but violence, integrating them as members of societies yet to be built. That's where we're active, and we come with people that have a special background. You, Mr. Stillhart, have direct contact to such people and such groups. IHL is only as good as the government that implements it, we sometimes say. What is the mood you feel in the field? Well, we often observe a certain discrepancy between what is said officially with regard to respecting international humanitarian law and with what you see in the field once troops have marched. I would say, however, that in many areas of conflict, military staff know the international humanitarian law rather well, and they know it's important to implement it, because military people know very well that once they do not treat prisoners of war decently, their own people, once taken prisoner, will not be treated decently either. So my experience is that armies in different countries do know IHL well, and they often see to it that IHL is abided by. Unfortunately, however, we keep seeing situations where IHL is not abided by, or where it is being violated on purpose, but I see the glass half full. You see, it's very important also for the future, for a time after a conflict, for IHL to be applied. Can you explain, please? Well, 1 month ago, prisoners of war were liberated in Yemen following 2 years of negotiations on the liberation of these 2,000 prisoners. And the way those prisoners are being treated, whether IHL is applied, will have a huge effect on how the population generally accepts it and how peace can be found after conflict. The same is true for people missing in action. We're active in many countries, in Bosnia, say, where we're still involved in the search of thousands of people that are still missing. The way people come together from different parties in order to solve this question of people missing in action have incredible consequences on how a population can overcome the stress of war. Before, Priska Seiler-Graf mentioned international cooperation. This is something that I have looked at ever since I took on my mandate as a member of parliament in the National Council. I always spoke against cutting budgets for international cooperation. I think it's very important to have sufficient funds for these efforts. Thinking about these zones of conflict, where do we need a change in development cooperation? I sometimes have a feeling that development cooperation such as we knew it may no longer be quite as effective today. Swiss development cooperation has a long-standing tradition. Can it be amended to make sure that it is better up to speed in areas of conflict after or during conflicts, so that it can be more effective? Well, look, there's one thing I keep noticing, particularly in long conflicts, and currently we don't see conflicts that start and are finished in a year or two. We've been present in such conflicts over decades at times, and this classical difference between long-term development cooperation that sets on once there's peace and humanitarian aid that is conducted during a conflict, such a difference can no longer be made. Thus, we need to think differently. We need to think outside the clusters of typically bureaucratic thought. Silo thinking is no longer possible. In countries, we see that there's one silo looking at development cooperation, another silo that looks at humanitarian aid, and what we would need is better cooperation between the two. And to make sure that means flow where they're required for sustainable effects. Well, what about Switzerland? How good is its cooperation here? Well, if I think about the propagation of peace, there we stand on two legs: civilian propagation of peace and military propagation of peace. That goes hand in hand often. I mentioned Mozambique. The Department of Foreign Affairs is in the lead in this dossier, and we send the experts from our area that are required. So there we work hand in hand. And indeed, it's not always easy, because the prerequisites to become active are not quite the same for the civilian and the military side. Because obviously the army is being controlled more stringently by politics than the civilian side is, which is a good thing. So sometimes it's very difficult for us to become active. Political steps take time, which is okay. We live in a democracy. But if you want to be more active, this is sometimes difficult. Could you mention an example? Well, civil peace propagation can happen on its own initiative. We can only have a role here once the United Nations have passed out a mandate for that, which is no easy thing, as we know. Very often, there's no possibility for such a mandate. Syria, say. And, of course, the army has to do with security. Security has to do with arms. The military law says that before an armed dispatch, the parliament needs to have a say. And we all know how long that takes. So, There are sometimes certain stumbling blocks, but we do work together closely. We also work very closely together in the Directorate of IHL. Say, school declaration is such an example. Think of all those schools destroyed in Syria. What a huge problem. There we worked together very hard. We took diplomatic steps, and diplomats represented our efforts to the outside. So many pieces of the puzzle that we produced together. With that, I think I can open it up to the audience at large. It's 10 to 7, and we said in the second half of this panel, you, as you listen in, are invited to participate in the discussion. You can send your questions to the chat, and Juliet and Vanessa will pass on your questions to the panel. Mention your name, mention your organization, and your questions will be addressed to the panelists. Ambassador Buhler, we talked about cooperation. We talked about moving out of silo thinking. How do you see that? Well, the Directorate of IHL is horizontal. We deal with a lot of different issues, diplomatic issues, hence there's lots of cooperation with the Department of Defense or the ICRC. And that helps us move away or move out of our silos because we need to see the big picture. And we try to act in the general interest of Switzerland. We're talking about how Switzerland could be better yet. We hear lots of good things, but we've also heard of certain discrepancies. Where do you think Switzerland, very specifically, would have to do more? Perhaps I could have a go at this. I also think Switzerland is an incredibly important country when it comes to IHL. Its neutrality is important, and Switzerland's credibility is great, particularly in IHL, where it has a very important role in its dissemination. I would sometimes wish for Switzerland to be a bit more courageous. Courageous when it comes to acting as a mediator, because there I think Switzerland would have to play an important card. And yes, it sometimes takes a bit of courage. There's always risks involved. If you take the role of a mediator, there's always a risk involved. At the same time, however, I do think Switzerland would have an important role to play. You say courageous. Courageous in what sense? More often or more demanding? Well, both actually. More often and more demanding. Well, you need to see this in the context of Switzerland not being used to failing. Failure is something that politicians don't like. I think, however, that we should have the courage to fail at times, because failing is part of life. I share your appreciation. Switzerland should do more, could do more, should be more courageous, more frequently so, and offer its good services as a mediator in many situations of conflict. Perhaps one more comment on coherence. It takes coherence between the departments. The IHL what used to be part of the realm of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Department of Defense only. This is no longer the case. It's important everywhere. And if we were more aware of that, I think we would be more courageous in speaking up in situations of conflict, taking an active role as a mediator. I see a great opportunity there for Switzerland to implement diplomatic ideas and to shore up Switzerland's political reputation, positioning Switzerland better. You were shaking your head? Well, I fully agree with what colleague Schneider-Schneider said, but horizontal thinking has rather receded in recent years as I see it. I do think, yes, departments need to work together more closely. Security policy and foreign policy are brothers in mind. Where do you feel that? I feel that priorities have shifted compared to Didier Buchhalter, Ignacio Cassis as another priority list. And I feel it in Parliament. It was one of the low points in discussions in the Security Policy Committee when we once got a political report about conflict that explained things very well, contextualized things well, and the members of the Commission said only, well, that report is far too long. The Security Policy Committee should not deal with foreign affairs matters. That's awful. We do need to work together. Cooperation is so important. I fully agree with Mr. Marchand. It takes civilian efforts and military efforts to propagate peace, because one side only cannot do it. So I would plea for us to do more and to be more courageous there. I fully agree. And yes, sometimes we can fail. I'd like to involve Mr. Mader as head of the ICRC also here, of the Red Cross also here. Very much so, yes. Our humanitarian tradition is based on the fact that we used to be courageous. This is what shore up our reputation as a humanitarian nation. And yes, we seem to shy away from those risks because of the fact that we don't want to fail. Well, I'm not so sure. I think Parliament could do more. The ban on nuclear wars. This is something that we've been fighting for such a long time. We have a mandate from the International Swiss Red Cross movement. Basically, Parliament approved of it. The Federal Council hesitates. And this is a contract that will enter into force in January next year because more than 50 countries have signed that agreement on a ban of nuclear weapons. In the past, we would have been more courageous on this. Switzerland doesn't have to be afraid to get involved in such areas. With all its credibility, it can afford to step in. There would be few reproaches leveled against Switzerland. So I think also Parliament could do more. I know from you, Mr. Marchand, that you think it's a good thing that the ban on nuclear weapons was not ratified. Well, as a representative of the administration, I need to represent the standpoint of the Federal Council. There are open questions here that are unanswered yet. COVID did not exactly help because the monitoring conference was postponed. And from the perspective of defense, there are certain security policy questions that we need to ask. What questions would those be? Well, look, there are two international laws, a 40-year-old IHL that embraces nuclear weapons involving 40 nations, and there's a second realm where the nuclear weapons are being seen negatively. They should be banned in all its uses. Now, as a lawyer, it is very difficult to come to an interpretation of these different threats. So from a security policy level, this is relevant, because in a new system, nuclear powers would not be involved, with the exception of Austria. None of our neighbors are involved, because they are either nuclear powers like France, or nuclear weapons are stationed on their territories. So we don't know to what extent we would still be able to work together with our neighbors in security policy if we ratified that agreement. That is one such security policy question. But we'll need to reflect on this. But Mr. Marshall, nobody understands that. Switzerland signed it, but ratification is not happening because of this monitoring. Seriously, I think we don't give away anything if we ratify that contract. That's what everyone expects from Switzerland. We need to set the example. Parliament has exerted some pressure at both levels. Motions were passed to ratify the ban on nuclear weapons. So I don't really understand why we tread so carefully, even though legally speaking it might be correct. Thank you. And at this point of time, I'd like to turn to Vanessa and Juliet. Were there questions? Well, there's several questions that we got in the chat. The first question is the following. What role is IHL to play in Switzerland's candidacy for a seat on the Security Council of the United Nations? Well, the motto for the candidacy is a plus for peace. That is, Switzerland will not change. We have a tradition in this area, tradition that we will keep supporting also in our candidacy. And if we are elected onto the Security Council, well, that's where we have a role, because Security Council deals with armed conflict. There's the link to IHL. And Switzerland does a lot to protect civilians, particularly in situations of armed conflict. So the Interdepartmental Committee on International Humanitarian Law, which participated in the drafting of the voluntary report, developed an action plan on this, which also answers the question as to where we should be more active. The action plan mentions various steps that were identified as areas where we could improve. And it also specifies where we and how we should deal with IHL in the realm of the Security Council. Can you mention a couple of points of that action plan? Well, it also says that Switzerland tries to clarify IHL in the context of new technologies, autonomous lethal weapons, say, or artificial intelligence. This is a new area. Geneva Conventions date back to 1949, as what was said. Things have developed since then, and therefore Switzerland sees it as preeminent for this question to be clarified. IHL must be applied fully. And also specific questions need to be answered. For example, the question whether the digital emblem of the ICRC is to be protected too, or whether cyber attacks can and should be compared to military attacks or armed attacks. These are things that need to be clarified. Or who bears the responsibility for an autonomous lethal weapon system that is used? How far are we there? Because these technologies are being used already. How far are we there? You know that, Mr. Marchand. Well, not very far, because the development of technology happens fast. It's also highly complex. But we have reached a certain acquis, because IHL can and should be applied also to such new technologies. This is undisputed. And it's also undisputed that it's human beings that will remain responsible and need the acquis. Certain results have been reached in the discussion, but already the question as to what is autonomous or automatic, those questions have not been clarified yet. I'd also like to briefly take up IHL and membership in the Security Council of Switzerland. I'm sure that Switzerland can do a lot to make sure IHL becomes more effective again. The membership of Switzerland in the Security Council that decides on war and peace? Question mark. I'm not so sure whether such membership does good services to the neutrality of Switzerland, that a good services Switzerland could provide. Of course, you can say it's only 2 years. It's not long. But Switzerland, with its tradition, with its neutrality, with its unique position worldwide, will in those 2 years have to abstain often, I fear, so as not to lose its credibility. That's one reason I was always skeptical whether membership in the Security Council is good for Switzerland. But obviously it would help the propagation of IHL. Is there a next question? Will Switzerland remain neutral when it comes to condemning violations of international humanitarian law? I think I can give a first answer. Well, this can be aligned with neutrality because Switzerland calls upon all parties to respect humanitarian law. Hence, it does not take sides. Hence, this is not in contradiction to neutrality. Rather, we see it as a commitment coming from our role in IHL, making sure that it's not only individual states, up to individual states, to see that IHL's respected countries also have a role in calling upon others to respect IHL. Well, look, we face the same challenge all the time. We have privileged access to governments, to armed groups, and there, as we speak face to face, we talk about such things openly. If we see violations being repeated, we go to public instances. This did not used to be the case 30 years ago. Violations were never condemned in the past. Now, the ICRC sometimes takes such issues public. So things have changed within the context of the Red Cross movement, and Switzerland can learn from this, I'm sure. But I'm also sure that Switzerland takes up such matters in confidential dialogues. Well, I think this is a role Switzerland has and can build up. For example, when it comes to finding evidence for war crimes. The role of the laboratory in Spiez, for example, has a very important job making sure that perpetrators of war crimes can be taken to court. And this is something that can easily be reconciled with neutrality. If there's a violation against IHL, Switzerland has a role in making sure that we can prove such violations have taken place. Switzerland is reticent in criticizing parties in conflicts openly because it wants to hold on to its role as a mediator. If you don't hear from the Federal Council, when there's no condemnation by the Federal Council, this may have to do with a lack of courage, but more often the Federal Council does not want to undermine its role as a mediator. As Mr. Marder said, publicly condemning parties in an armed conflict bears the danger that we lose contact and access. And still, neutrality in itself is not a goal. Neutrality is a means to a goal. And hence we need to reflect intelligently about neutrality to reach IHL goals. So you need to sometimes remind yourself of what's important. Also, we, the Red Cross, sometimes need to sum up the courage to condemn a party publicly. And Mr. Marcher said it, we sometimes see things that are simply not acceptable. Particularly if your staff is being attacked, you cannot remain silent. No, you cannot remain silent, but we need to be careful that we speak out not only when our people are attacked, because we're there to protect the people that are affected by the conflict. And we need to be very, very careful in our communication, not to think of ourselves only. So we need to speak out when civilians are affected, not only when we are affected only. Other questions? What role does the Swiss Red Cross play in the connection of IHL? That's a question for me, obviously. We support the authorities in the dissemination of IHL. We do so through the services of the Red Cross, through military attachés. We disseminate IHL in schools. We have young delegates that go to schools and that have developed playful means and ways to talk about the international humanitarian law. Together with the ICRC or the German Red Cross, we are developing an app to train IHL. There's a brochure for members of parliament. Our tasks are manifold there, because it is our mandate from the Geneva Conventions, and we work hand in hand with authorities. An app? How does it work? I have not seen it yet. As I said, we're working on it. You put questions and you get answers, I'd say. Maybe there's a film, I don't know. There's probably a keyword index. It's probably like a first aid app where you get step-by-step training on how to implement IHL. I suppose the army has taken it a bit further. You have a game and it looks like an ego shooter. Can I say that? Well, look, we realized we need to reach out to young soldiers. And therefore, we decided to speak to them directly, and I think we are the very first worldwide to have developed a tool on the basis of serious games, as they're called. It's not an ego shooter, just not. But it works on the basis of an interactive interface, which carries a training module to pass on the basic information on IHL. We developed it together with our media department, and we're happy to disseminate this. Also abroad? Well, yes, and we'll be offering it to the United Nations. Let's look at this, because you brought it with you, didn't you?
Nämlich wenn und solange sie selbst direkt an den Kampfhandlungen teilnehmen. Diese Frau nimmt direkt an Kampfhandlungen teil, also darf sie bekämpft werden.
Los! Wieder zum zweiten Stock!
Ja, Frau Seiler-Graf, wie kommt das rein?
Ms. Seiler-Graf, what's your impression? Phew, this is not my line of games, but I suppose when you want to address young men, which is the primary audience, this is probably a way to do so. But it's not my language, but I have two sons and they will probably take that up. Well, yes, the use of force is always a difficult thing. But it is the job of a soldier to know what to do when. We also tested the tool in the context of various troops, and we got good feedback from that. We got good comments on that. Hence, we were motivated to develop this further. There are also other scenarios that talk about taking prisoners, how to treat prisoners. Now that was an example from an active scene of fighting. Those texts on international humanitarian laws are unwieldy. This is not something that normal consumers can digest. Hence, they need to be worked up in more accessible forms. We try to come to an equation for IHL. UV2 is the difference between a legitimate military target and protected persons or goods. It's the carefulness that you need to have to limit damage to civilians. And once there's collateral damage, you need to do the necessary steps to get the balance right. So UV2 is our equation. And if we were conformed in this, if these three principles are understood, we've gained a lot. And the details can then be added on a needs-to-know basis. What can we do better? What can we do more? Well, the dissemination of IHL is important, but also the integration of IHL in the systems is important. It starts with our doctrine and it trickles down to the individual soldier. Are countries aware in areas of conflict? Well, I realized in the field that our efforts in involving key leaders is important. We need to interact with decision makers. We need to first build trust for that, of course, build up motivation for that, so that such disastrous negative effects can be mitigated or limited to the max. Thank you. Any other questions? There's not much time left, but one more question is fine. There's little likelihood of a war breaking out in Switzerland, but what can Switzerland do to prevent images like we saw before when we looked at Homs? This is probably about explosive weapons in populated areas. Is there something Switzerland can do there? Not use them is the only thing you can do, not use them. What you showed us before, Homs, in the past 5 years, I've seen more such images than in the 25 years past. So many cities were devastated in recent years, more so than ever before since the Second World War. And this is mostly the result of large caliber weapons being used or the result of aerial attacks on cities that produce a devastation over kilometers, flattening everything. So we, together with Switzerland, have launched a diplomatic process on such weapons and their use, hoping to establish and draft an agreement that would ban the use on such large caliber weapons on populated areas. The principles Mr. Marsha mentioned, distinction between civilian and military targets with large caliber weapons in such densely populated areas, impossible. It's impossible. This is indeed something the ICRC launched an initiative on at the level of the UN. That's an important discussion. Guidelines must be found. Sometimes a bit sad, though, when the military keeps mentioning the necessity of large caliber weapons also in its arsenals. If I think that such large caliber weapons will be used in densely populated Switzerland, there I have my question marks. I've also launched initiatives on this in Switzerland, but not everyone agrees on that. But the further discussion progresses at the level of the UN, the more it will have an effect on Swiss armament programs too. Very, very often, of course, armed groups seek protection in densely populated areas, hence the attacking side has its difficulties too. But I do think in future, use of such explosive weapons must be better limited. Well, 100 years ago, armies used to meet in open fields. This is no longer the case. Wars have changed. One very final question. You mentioned the International Court of Justice. What does this have to do with the IHL, and what's the involvement of Switzerland there? The ICC acts when states are not in a position to take action against war crimes. It has a subsidiary role there. Switzerland is part of that too. It has ratified that. Connection to IHL is the following. Such war crimes are violations of international humanitarian law. One thing helps the other. We fight impunity there. Thank you very much, Corinne Ciceron-Bühler. I would have wanted to ask each and every one of you as to what gives you hope when it comes to IHL. I will only ask Dominic Stillhardt, however, for reasons of time, because he is the person most in the field. Is there something that makes you hopeful? Well, I'm hopeful when I see that people in such areas of conflict keep finding solutions. Even in the worst, in the direst situations, in cities of which we saw an image before, people find solutions to survive and to start rebuilding their lives. This is something that gives me hope. And that's something that is a good lesson for us. We do not always have to think that we need to bring the solutions to the people. Thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you very much to Ambassador Bühler. Thank you to Markus Mader, Director of the SRK. You have the final word. Thank you very much. Dear participants, dear panelists, thank you very much. Thank you very much for this rich and constructive debate on the implementation of humanitarian law in and by Switzerland, because it showed that Switzerland does a lot, nationally and internationally. This month, it's been 30 years that I've been with the ICRC, with the Red Cross. Some things have changed. It's been quite a roller coaster. Sometimes I'm depressed when I see what still happens. On the other hand, I see glimmers of hope. For example, when I look at the voluntary report at hand, where Switzerland indeed is taking a leading role. This is one of those examples we talked about before. One example where Switzerland was courageous, which makes me optimistic. And I hope that Switzerland will also be courageous in other areas, the exportation of war materials or the ban on nuclear weapons, say. We have a partnering role in Switzerland, hence we must, by our mandate, support states nationally and internationally, also through the promotion for the respect of IHL. I'm happy to have that role as a partner of the military authorities, the public authorities of Switzerland. And I also thank the involvement of the public, because it takes all our involvement as civil society organizations, NGOs, authorities, etc. We've heard it today, we've seen it today. And I'm very happy that we have something to contribute to this. And I thank everyone who contributes to the dissemination of IHL, because it's about the people. It's about the protection of these people, which are protected by IHL. Thank you all for your participation. Thank you for co-hosting this evening, this event. Ambassador Cicero Bühler, thank you for the partnership in the authorship of the report. I thank the panelists. I thank the moderator, and I thank everyone behind the scenes. I think we have shown tonight that we muster a will. There's a lot to do, and there's a lot that remains to be done. Have a nice evening.